Markus and I were the two co-chairs of this particular regional assessment for Europe and Central Asia. So I'm going to take you through some of the main findings of what came out of the assessment and just give you an idea. Are you all familiar with the IPBES concept and process? Have you all read the 1,000-page technical report of the European assessment in Central Asia? Okay, that's good. So I can skip through this quickly. I've got 10 minutes, I think. What I just want to focus on, though, is I'm just going to run through some of the main points that came out of this particular assessment. But I've got a sub-title here. What's the problem and what's the solution? Because a lot of what we did is actually based on trying to highlight the problems for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And it's important we recognize that. But we're also trying to focus on whether we can find solutions. What are the options available to particularly the policy community to try and take things forward. So the assessment itself, of course, was requested by governments. So it's a governmental process. So the whole point about this is to try and understand what's going on in this particular region to inform better policy development. So lots of people were involved. We reviewed massive amounts of evidence through all sorts of different documents. We had lots and lots of comments, nearly 8,000 comments from external reviewers. So it's an enormously comprehensive assessment of all of the knowledge about biodiversity and ecosystem services in the Europe and Central Asia region. Now, that region itself is on this map here. If there are any geographers in the room, you will realize that half of this is Asia, strictly speaking, but this is United Nations and best designation. So we cover a vast territory, including Eastern Europe. Russia, of course, is a very, very large area. And one of the big challenges we had in undertaking the assessment, so the assessment, for those of you not familiar, an assessment is reviewing the available literature, but then synthesizing the main messages that come out from that. And we had to review all the literature that's out there on the topic of biodiversity and ecosystem services. One of the key challenges we had is there's lots of the terrestrial surface over here, not so much over here. All the literature is over there, and there's nothing over here. All the data's in the west, not in the east. And so to some extent, we were challenged with trying to come up with conclusions for parts of the region which were underrepresented. Right, so straight in with the first major outcome. All you really need to know from this figure when you look at it is that it's all red, or all the arrows are going down, right? So this is actually the assessment of trends in biodiversity, almost always negative everywhere. What you'll see here, this is Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. So those are the 4 sub-regions I showed you on the map previously. And this shows a whole range of what we call units of analysis, both terrestrial and inland surface water, and a little bit about coastal marine as well. So these different types of biomes, if you like, or ecosystem types. And that's really quite a shocking outcome, isn't it? Let's face it, that's the trends in biodiversity. Everything is going down. In spite of supposed efforts to try and halt the arrest of biodiversity loss. And this is just some of the key statistics. So wetlands have declined by 50% since 1970 in most of the western part of that territory. Biodiversity is declining 40 out of 15 terrestrial habitat types since the 1950s. Only 9% marine habitat types show favorable conservation status. So there's some serious problems going on here. And we take that further in terms of species. 26% of marine fish populations have declined in the last decade. This is just the last 10 years, yeah? There's been some gains. Let's be a little bit positive about this. 2% of populations have increased, mostly through improved fisheries management in some parts of the region. But look at this, 42% of terrestrial animal and plant species have declined in 10 years. This is really phenomenal rates of change. 71% of freshwater fish, 60% of amphibians. So really significant statistics when we start looking at this. And the implication, of course, is that losses of biodiversity have an impact on us as people. It has an impact on human well-being. It has an impact on quality of life. We use this expression in the IPBES process called nature's contributions to people, which embodies the concept of ecosystem services. And I won't go into the debate about that particular term, but it's meant to be more wide-reaching, and also to include disservices as well as benefits. But what we found is, for example, more than 50% of the regulating services, if you like, or regulating contributions to people have declined from the 1960s to 2016. What we did find, though, is that, if you look at the graphic here, these are different types of nature's contributions. You actually see there's one big success here. So food has massively increased. So actually what we've done is, in the region, we've been really good at increasing food production. But that has come at the expense, as a direct correlation, at the expense of regulating services and the non-material contributions, things that relate to the cultural ecosystem services and aesthetics and things like this. So again, it's a very clear picture about what's going on. Species decline, biodiversity decline, increasing food production, decreasing just about everything else. And we looked at future scenarios as well. So that's the past trends based on the observational studies that are out there. But if we look at the future as well, basically what we have here, these are called archetypes of different scenarios, different types of pathways into the future. So business as usual is we just carry on what we're doing. Economic optimism means we have a focus on the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And what you can see from this, well, first of all, the business as usual, again, this is the different nature's contributions to people. Business as usual is just not an option. If we continue to do what we're doing now, we'll lose more biodiversity and we'll lose more of nature's contributions to ourselves. But what we also found is even across all these scenarios, there's some are much better. Obviously, the more sustainability-orientated scenarios are better, but they're still not perfect. And we found that there are trade-offs across all scenarios. There's no single world future which will give us multiple benefits across everything. However, we do know that some scenarios are better than others. An important point about this, the reason I'm showing you is, and I'll come back to this later, it is about choices. So when we look at the future scenarios, we can work out the worlds that give us the most benefits for biodiversity. And as societies, we have choices about which of those future trajectories we want to follow. So it's quite important. The other issue we looked at, and this is actually also for the scenarios, but the business as usual just gives the current trend. We looked at the HE biodiversity targets and the Sustainable Development Goals. How well are we doing on that? How well are we doing? Really, really badly. Absolutely, appallingly badly. The only HE biodiversity target that we are meeting in the region is the increase in protected areas. Right, so we've got some administrative designations going on. So we are achieving something, but everything else in terms of a whole range of HE biodiversity targets, SDGs, it's all pretty negative. And many of the future scenarios, again, see continued declines. So what's going on? What's happening? This is where it comes back to GLP. What is the problem? What is the cause of the problem? Well, the cause of the problem, of course, is us, all of us in this room and everybody outside this room. So it's human activities that are the cause of the problem, fundamentally. We found the most important direct driver of biodiversity loss is land use change and land use intensification of the management of that land. That was the critical one. Both, it's the same for freshwater as for terrestrial ecosystems. The impacts are due to land use change and land use intensification. We found that climate change is also an increasingly important driver, and of course we anticipate that to become more of a problem going forward into the future. But other issues like natural resource extraction, pollution, invasive alien species are also very, very important direct drivers. And all of these activities reflect the indirect drivers that are us, reflect societal choices about a number of things, what we consume, how much of it we consume, our diets. It reflects government policy, economic growth, population growth, of course, there's too many of us, and technological development. And we also found, because we were asked specifically to look at this topic, we found there's also been an erosion of, or major loss of indigenous and local knowledge, and much of that knowledge is often associated with quite biodiversity-friendly practices, so we're losing those practices as well. Again, coming back to what the impact we have, the other thing we found, of course, is that the problem is not just within the region itself. We displace, as Europeans and Central Asians, we displace our problem to the rest of the world as well. So the European Union, for example, imports about 20% of its food. That has to be produced somewhere else, and it has negative impacts elsewhere. And this is just to give you an idea. This is the ecological footprint. If we look at Western Europe, which is 5.1 hectares per person per year. So each of us in Western Europe consumes that much land for the renewable resources that we consume of all different types. But in the biocapacity of Western Europe is 2.2 hectares. That's how much we produce of renewable resources. So as you can see, there's a major mismatch between these two. And it's the same picture in the other regions as well. It comes down to consumption. But the great conundrum here is that we know that within Europe, it's the land use intensification which is having a big impact. So let's de-intensify, right? Let's solve the problem that way. What does that do? You produce less food. What does that do? It means you have to import more food. So actually, by solving the problems within the region, we potentially increase the problems or displace those problems to the rest of the world. And there's, on a global planet, there's no benefit to anyone in doing that. Right, I'm going to be quick. What can we do about it? A couple more slides, I'm not too far off. We can do mainstreaming within policy. We can do things like better integration of biodiversity-friendly policies across different policy sectors. At the moment, agriculture, fisheries, water, services, manufacturing, sectoral policies are completely disjointed. Right? The common agricultural policy in the European Union is incredibly important. It doesn't do very much for biodiversity protection. So we need to do that. We need more participation. We need balanced uses of contributions, not just food production. We need to balance across how we interact with nature. We should start thinking about decoupling economic growth from the degradation of nature as well. At the moment, there are still perverse subsidies in place that encourage people to consume more. They make goods cheaper, they consume more, and it's a problem. We need to think about measuring national welfare beyond economic indicators only. We need, obviously, to continue conservation efforts through protected areas. Right, this is my last slide, and it's a nice, simple one for you to have a look at. Thought you'd like this. But this is actually, I would say in a way, this is my optimism for the future slide. All right? It doesn't look like it, but I'll just explain it to you very quickly if I can, what's going on here. So these are different policy sectors along the top. These are the 3 steps of mainstreaming, raising awareness, defining policy objectives, designing instruments and policies. And these are, this list, you don't have to look at the details, a whole range of different policy actions that policymakers can implement. Now, what the colors mean is that, basically the greens are effectively implemented, if it's dark green, implemented with scope for improvement, not developed, not yet initiated at all. So this is just a map, a roadmap in a way, of where we are presently in terms of biodiversity-related policy. So the only good thing you could say about that is, well, there isn't very much dark green, yeah? Okay? And there's quite a reasonable amount of light green, but there's also a big amount of red and purple and things like that. So basically, that means we're not doing anywhere near enough to conserve biodiversity. But put that more positively, we've got enormous scope of things that we can do at a policy and political level that would make things a lot better. Look at all these actions, loads and loads of them, lots of things we can do, and right across the different regions as well. So, perfectly for time up, my last slide conclusions, just very quickly then. We failed to meet the biodiversity targets. The way we do things currently is just simply unsustainable in terms of biodiversity and provision of ecosystem services. Business as usual is not an option, but we do have enormous scope to do things better, right? At a policy level, and that's the things we're trying to communicate to governments, that there are things that can be done much better. And we could even contribute to biodiversity gains if we really put our mind to putting things in place. But finally, we can't just, all of us as individuals, assume that policy is going to solve all of these problems. There is the need for society to engage in these issues. We need education, we need to think about consumption, and we need to think about the shared responsibility that all of us have in maintaining the biological resources around us. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry?
What are the low-hanging fruit in your opinion?
Yeah, I think perverse subsidies is one. Fisheries subsidies, particularly. I can't remember the exact figures, but the subsidies were something like 6 billion euros still in existence in the European Union and in Russia as well. So things like that. Yeah, there's no reason for it. We can deal with that. Well, there's lobbies probably that prevent that are barriers to this. That would be the main thing to do. I think there's also, which you see this process going on, the whole awareness raising about issues is really important. So that's what, in a way, the IPBES process is. We do a lot of communication work beyond just doing the assessments. We go talk to the media, we talk to individual groups around the world and try and communicate some of these issues. So that's really important. We can do that. That's quite cheap to do, communicating education, awareness raising. The protected areas thing is interesting. 25% of the EU, terrestrial surface of the EU is now protected areas. The biodiversity target is 17%, so actually the EU has surpassed that. However, the way in which we manage those protected areas is really critical as well, because we're still losing biodiversity, yet we've got wonderful protected areas. So, there's something that needs to be addressed there. I could probably go on for far too long, but those would be a couple of the ideas.
Just a quick question, yes.
Yeah, very quick question. The second part of ecosystem services, they were not necessarily related to biodiversity. Oh, yes.
Great question, and it's always the tough one. As you're probably aware, there's a big debate in the literature about attributing biodiversity loss to the provision of ecosystem services. In the same way that there's the similar debate around attributing ecosystem functioning to biodiversity per se. And it's really, really difficult to do. I think you can find lots of examples where you can find those causal relationships. I think you can find other examples where we continue to supply ecosystem services, or ecosystems continue to function adequately well, even with biodiversity loss. So it's not a clear relationship. I think my view would be there has to be a precautionary principle involved here. If we start driving biodiversity downwards, then we'll start hitting tipping points and thresholds where if we go over, you're going to have irreversible impacts. So I think it's something that we just need to maintain our biological resources as best we can for our own benefit, if not for the intrinsic value of the biodiversity itself.
Thanks very much. Thank you. So actually that question leads us really nicely to our next work, which is on the Biodiversity Exploratories, which I'll be presenting myself, if I can work out how to attach this. My name is Pete Manning. I'm from Senckenberg in Frankfurt. But I'm really presenting this on behalf of a huge consortium of people involved in this Biodiversity Exploratories project. And the background of that project is that about 20-odd years ago, in the 90s, ecologists became concerned that biodiversity loss was occurring and that this biodiversity loss could lead to the loss of ecosystem functions and ecosystem services. And so biodiversity experiments were established in which the amount of biodiversity in these plots varies and ecosystem functions are measured. And what these experiments show, and there were many of these set up, what these experiments shown was that biodiversity did strongly affect ecosystem processes in these experiments. But biodiversity loss in this controlled way doesn't happen in the real world. In the real world, we see a much more complicated picture where global change drivers, as we've just heard, such as land use and global warming, affect biodiversity both directly. The global change drivers affect biodiversity, but they affect processes directly and via biodiversity. And they also affect not just the number of species in the ecosystem, but what type of species we have in the ecosystem. So we get changes in functional composition occurring as well. And what we don't know is how important biodiversity loss is relative to these other pathways of change. How important is this biodiversity loss in driving ecosystem processes and the overall level of multifunctionality in an ecosystem? And then to make that more socially relevant, we really have to ask, how does it affect multiple ecosystem services and the multifunctionality of an ecosystem in terms of delivering all the benefits that we want from it? So this question, this relationship between land use, biodiversity, and multiple ecosystem services is being looked at in this very large-scale and long-term Biodiversity Exploratories project. And this is probably one of the biggest projects of this type in the world. It's a huge project involving hundreds of scientists, and it's been funded by the DFG in Germany for over 10 years now. And it's continuing on as well. And in this project, what we've got is 3 regions, one in the north of Germany, one in the center, and one in the south. The Schorfheide, the Hainich, and the Schwäbische Alb. And in each of these, there's 50 grassland plots, 50 forest plots, making 150 of these each across the whole study. And these plots are chosen to select a range of land use intensity, the full range within those landscapes. And on those plots, pretty much everything you could imagine in terms of ecosystem processes, but also biodiversity are measured. And that allows us to look at this question in a more detailed way than has previously been possible. So as well as sharing these plots for measurements, we also have shared analytical tools. And one of these is this land use intensity index. And here we take the standardized values of fertilization, mowing and grazing. This is on the grasslands. And this forms a composite measure of the land use intensity on these plots. And here we can see the effect of that land use intensity on biodiversity. This is a measure called multidiversity, which summarizes the overall diversity of the system of multiple different groups. Here we can see the tree of life. All those in green are represented in this measure. So it's a composite measure of the whole biodiversity of a system. And what we're seeing is that particularly between low to medium levels of land use, we see a strong decline in biodiversity. But if land use varies over time, we actually see an increase in biodiversity. It maintains it to a certain extent if land use is varying. So what's the implications of that? Well, if we look at ecosystem processes and services, we see across that land use intensity gradient, here you've got 14 different ecosystem processes and ecosystem service indicators, and we can see that some of them are actually responding positively to land use intensity, others have a kind of net neutral effect, and others decline in response to land use intensification. We can aggregate these measures into an overall measure of ecosystem multifunctionality, of how well the ecosystem is performing. And we did this in a way in which we took these measures representing different things that a land user might want from the landscape. So here we have one scenario in which we take just production-based measures of biomass and forage quality, and we create a multifunctionality measure of just a farmer that was wanting to intensify the landscape. And then we increase more the functions to represent sustainability. And here we've got, in this case, for example, presence of pollinators, natural enemies, and so on. And here we have a scenario where you've basically got multifunctionality measured from the perspective of a conservationist or a national park manager, where things, cultural services like flower cover and bird diversity are included in the measure. So if we look at these measures and how they respond to land use intensity, then we're seeing the same kind of pattern that Mark just presented in miniature in a way. We're seeing this where if we look at just production, intensification is increasing production quite strongly. This is why we do it in the first place. But the more measures of other ecosystem services and the sustainability of the system we take into account, and the more cultural values we take into account from the ecosystem, the more that relationship levels off and becomes negative once we take these cultural ecosystem services into account. So we see that land use intensification increases production-based multifunctionality, but it reduces the cultural multifunctionality of the system. So then we're asking, is this due to the direct effect of land use on these functions, or is it mediated by biodiversity? And we did this within a structural equation model in which we're able to disentangle these two different processes. And we also accounted for the fact that land use intensity doesn't just reduce diversity, but it changes what type of plant we have in the system. It basically speeds up the kind of growth of the plants. It encourages fast-growing plant species that have a fast tissue turnover and tend to accelerate nutrient cycling rates. So we asked, is it changes in diversity, or is it changes in the type of species that's accounting for these changes in the multifunctionality of the system? And what we found, this is a very complex figure showing those different paths that were colored on the previous figures. What we found here is that effectively the importance of biodiversity or functional composition depends on what you want from the ecosystem, but it also depends on regions as well. So the importance of diversity differed between regions. It depended on who you were, what you wanted from the ecosystem, but we do find some cases where land use, and this is the ones you see here, where land use intensification is reducing biodiversity, and that in turn is reducing the multifunctionality of the ecosystem. Then obviously we're in a case where we haven't just got plant diversity present here, but we've got diversity of a whole range of different organisms in the system. And in another study we asked which parts of this ecosystem are responsible for ecosystem function. So we controlled for all the different other drivers of ecosystem function statistically the best we could. And here we found that pretty much every different trophic group, every different functional group in the ecosystem, the diversity of it, played some kind of role in increasing some sort of ecosystem function. So there was impacts particularly of above ground herbivores and plants, but also microbes and below ground herbivores in driving ecosystem function in these experimental plots. So what we see is that diversity is strongly related to the delivery of ecosystem functions and services in grasslands, even when these other drivers are accounted for. And here we can see the proportional effect just of biodiversity and what's shared with other drivers of ecosystem function in this ecosystem. So I'm just going to finish by saying a little bit about the forests in the exploratories. Here we, rather than having a single land use intensity measure, it's hard to measure land use intensity in a forest in a scale of a single plot because it tends to operate on a rather large scale. So here we look at the structural properties of the forest which are influenced by land use, things like the tree composition, whether you've got a lot of conifers or oaks, the size of the trees and the variation in structure within the forest in terms of its heterogeneity, the amount of dead wood left in the forest and so on. And in recent analyses, we've related the biodiversity, again, of a whole range of different organisms found in the forest and different measures of it here of diversity, but I'm going to concentrate on this one, richness. And here we can see that different forest structures, here's all those different forest measures, all sorts of different forest properties drive the diversity of different, the biodiversity of different groups within the forest. And we see a similar situation when we look at ecosystem services in the forest. Here we've got, again, a whole set of different ecosystem service measures measured in the forest. And this is the role of these different forest features in driving those. And different forest features promote different ecosystem services. And the message behind this is, because you can't always have all these forest features at the same time, is that if we want a wide range of different ecosystem services, we need variety and diversity in our forests, not just in terms of species composition, but also in the physical structure of the forest. We need different shapes and sizes of forests containing different species if we're going to maximize biodiversity and also have high levels and a range of different ecosystem services as well. So in conclusion, what we find is that biodiversity ecosystem function relationships, as Mark was saying in answer to the questions earlier, are very difficult to detect in the real world because there's all these confounding factors. It's very difficult to disentangle what's going on in an ecosystem to find that signal of how biodiversity is affecting ecosystem processes. But with the kind of data that we're able to get in these shared platform type projects, there's a wealth of data there that allows us, combined with statistical methods, to unravel this complexity and find out where biodiversity is driving ecosystem function and ecosystem services. And this has shown that the role of biodiversity is more complex and nuanced than we've seen in these experiments, that there's a complex role of diversity in driving ecosystem services, but we're just starting to get a handle on what that role is. And there's a lot of challenges for the future, which we're continuing to address in this project, particularly in upscaling this relationship to the kind of policy and management relevant scales that most of the people at this conference have been presenting on, and trying to get from this kind of small plot scale stuff to what the real role of biodiversity is at that landscape scale. So with that, I just want to thank you for your attention, but also thank particularly Markus, who's the chair of the project, the speaker of the whole Biodiversity Exploratories project. And thanks to the people that support this work, there's a whole team of people behind this big project, and obviously very many authors that contribute both intellectually and in terms of data to this giant project. So thanks a lot for your attention. Thanks.
Especially when later on to upscale, also to show like how the different sites respond differently?
Yeah, so I mean, we've unfortunately, I mean, these are sites at a big level in that you've got, 50 sites within each of these sites, but at a regional level, we see that there is big differences, as you can see here, in how biodiversity is controlling function. And that's a challenge to get beyond that context dependency and to really understand it and to find general rules as to where and in which situations biodiversity plays its biggest role. And there is a number of studies starting to get to that, but at the moment we're not able to generalize.
Yeah, it was really nice to see this wonderful study. I mean, one of the, I guess, the real beauties is this like longitudinal.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing really about the time or how things change, or are there certain years where it explains some of the change?
Yes, I would say that question has been underexplored so far in this study. So we haven't made the fullest use of the longitudinal data yet. It would be interesting to see if you get stronger effects in certain years. As you say, we are able to say that land use is changing over time, biodiversity is responding to that. Exactly how much, and we also can see that there's time lags in this system where you get, say that kind of compositional change that I was talking about. We have looked at that, and the soil system takes a while to catch up with that type of change. So we're able to capture that kind of process, but I would say it's so far been underexplored. Yeah.
So you define biodiversity as being species richness for your study?
Mm-hmm.
You could define biodiversity on several different scales. So genetics, I don't know, interspecies differences in ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think your results might change if you consider different scales of biodiversity?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. So species richness is taken as a proxy here of kind of functional diversity, but it's also the unit we tend to conserve in. In other studies, not within this one, but within those experiments I showed at the beginning, we've been starting to look at how different components of biodiversity contribute to functioning. So rather than looking at it as just species richness, looking at how different aspects of the functional diversity, the phylogenetic diversity, how these different aspects are controlling function, we find that each plays its own role. So it's difficult because we kind of want to keep the message simple. Biodiversity is important, but from a fundamental understanding point of view, we do need to look at those different components and work out which of these components are really driving function. And that, again, that's a thing which this field's just starting to do, is to look at the simultaneous effect of these different components of functioning.
Yeah, so very interesting talk, and I guess when we say biodiversity is important, clearly it's important to you, and it might be important to some other people as well. But right now, it's not so clear that it's so very important from some kind of objective viewpoint. And so I think it's really important to be considering these newer models like nature's contributions to people that engage directly with what's probably the most important questions. What's the demand for biodiversity, and how can you address this demand? How can you understand that demand? It might be a stronger part of the case for biodiversity.
Yeah.
Any kind of objective.
I agree.
Service argument.
I agree. I mean, there's this ethical argument as well. This, biodiversity as a kind of cultural service in its own right, if you like, which does need to be accounted for. Yeah, I mean, there is that. It's going back to the original arguments for conservation in some respects. But we also need to make that. Here, we're just starting to make that link from these functional biodiversity processes all the way through to services. And in all cases, not every case, I don't think, will you find that link. But in certain cases, we will be able to, or hope to be able to show how actual functional biodiversity at the basic level is contributing to people. And we need to, move up the scales in this field so that we're able to show that that pathway of effects. That's a challenge in doing that, and I think that's where the kind of cutting edge of this field is right now.
Just a quick follow-on. Is there a risk that you might actually prove that biodiversity isn't really all that important to ecosystem services, and therefore the argument is, in principle, based on the argument, is gone?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's going to be definite cases where it's a specific species which drives the function, not necessarily biodiversity itself. I mean, here we can see in this particular case that it's the type of species that's most important, not the number of species. You know, we can see that in this data right here. So yeah, this is a case where you can say, all right, but you know, for the cultural services, that's not the case. We can see here, but for these production-based functions, it was just, you know, due to the kind of species that was there, whether the system was working well or not. So yeah, there is going to be cases where biodiversity isn't the main driver of ecosystem function. And that's when we need to go back and recognize its other values if we're going to conserve it and value it.
Yeah, maybe there is a way to go one level further, because here we are talking about a very simple system, few species.
A few thousand, yeah, yeah.
But let's go to the tropics,
Yeah.
where we don't even know how many species we have in
Yeah.
our flock. And then things, the definition we have in the city, talking about ecosystems and how the system works, will be a little bit different. So maybe how can we compare? I guess there are some studies with, I don't know if it's with comparable information and plots that we could use to try to, you know, come along these big questions on not counting only species, but the ecosystem functioning.
I mean, here we're trying to sort of show a general effect of species diversity, and that's something which, you know, if we can find that context dependency we just discussed, then we can say in most systems in the world, species loss will have this kind of effect on function if we can understand those rules. But obviously, when you upscale, you need to simplify. But you know, you get information loss there as well. So if you're going to talk about the functional role of diversity, then it does need a certain amount of detail, because biodiversity is a complex thing. I think I should probably finish there, because I'm running over my own time. I'm not.
Only 2 flash talks left, though, right?
Oh, is that the case, or?
I think based on the program of who is supposed to speak, but the other one and myself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we have another half an hour, so.
Okay.
Good, right?
I should have given you more time.
Yeah. And then,
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question because you presented some conclusion about grasslands and saying that diversity increases the delivery of ecological functions. Even when you consider confounding variables, I have to ask if you consider the presence of grazing animals as confounding variables. Did you analyze the effects of the grazing animals on biodiversity?
Yeah, so I mean, here we're in that land use intensity index is the density of grazing animals, so of livestock, not of the which are the main consumers here. You've got some wild herbivores, but not so many. So yeah, the impact of like high numbers of livestock is in that measure. So we're seeing the effect of them on the diversity in these kind of models, and then in turn the effect, and that direct effect that we talk about is the effect also of the direct effect of those herbivores and those livestock on the ecosystem functioning. So yeah, it's accounted for in that model. But it's hard to, we can also do models where we separate out those land use components, but they tend to be so highly correlated that it's hard to prize their effects apart. Fertilization and mowing, for example, are super highly correlated, so it's really hard to say which of these is driving the system.
Results showed it's at least as much as the API effects. So
Yeah.
I don't think, and if you look here at the special group of herbivores, is of course proportionally important. But
I mean, here we need to be careful because we have positive effects and a few negative effects too, and these are still correlational relationships after you've controlled for everything we possibly could. So, you know, we've controlled for as much as we possibly could. We still find that there is positive associations between diversity and function for most groups. It does seem to be playing some role in most functions, but we still have to acknowledge that this is a correlational study, even though we've controlled as much as we can. Okay, great. So thank you very much. I'll hand over. our next speaker is Davnah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for chairing, Davnah Payne, and who is giving a flash talk on the Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment.
Yeah. We're good?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to be quick, but we have still have half an hour. So if I go a little bit over my time, I won't sweat too much about it. My talk is about the role of biodiversity and the relationship between people and land in mountains. So it's obviously very mountain specific. It's I'm the presenter, but it's work we've done together with a bunch of other people, in particular Mark, Eva, and Markus from the Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment. And I will say right away that I'm jumping over the problem of biodiversity, and I'm actually not going to speak so much about biodiversity, but mostly about ecosystem services. But really what I will be talking about is what is in between, what's there. So we are talking about the relationship between people in however you want to define them, with their human well-being, livelihoods, rights, culture, diversity, and land. And again, there's a lot of things we say about land, degradation, grabbing rights, all that. And there's a relationship between the two, and we are here in the land science community. But really what we were interested in, partly in that project, is to look at how the relationship between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being might play a role, in fact, in this relationship between people and land. And so that's what we're interested in. And because we're mountain people and we're overly ambitious, we decided to look at it in all the mountains of the world. So all those colored pieces here are mountain ranges according to our inventory. And we thought, well, let's look at it at that scale. And because our chair, Markus Fischer, is so much an IPBES guy, we kind of had to use the IPBES framework. And it turned out to be quite useful. But so we've applied the framework that was behind the IPBES assessment to do our own assessment, our mountain-specific assessment. And we have looked at all those components, so biodiversity and ecosystems, ecosystem services, human well-being. We've looked at the direct drivers, which were mentioned in the previous talk as well, and some of the indirect drivers. And mountains are a little bit difficult to handle because they're kind of layered in different elevational belt that we had to take into consideration. So we have divided our mountains in kind of 5 layers, which are those natural systems down there. As was presented in the first talk, human well-being has a number of various dimensions, so we have looked at a whole bunch of them. Ecosystem services were described or discussed in terms of nature's contribution to people, so we have tried to capture those different aspects that people can get from nature, and we have looked at the traditional direct drivers. And we've done that not only in the typical assessment way, in that we have not only used literature, but we have also run a survey that we did online that was way too long, way too complicated. We had to have a lot of people answer that knew nothing about the question we're asking about, but we got some very useful answers. And what I'm going to focus on, as I said, are the ecosystem services. And what I'm showing here is first a figure of ecosystem service supply. And we're focused, because of the variety of answers we got, the coverage we had, etc. We kind of focused on 4 specific mountain regions in the world: the Andes, the Hindu Kush, the European Alps, and the African mountains. But I'm showing results now only for the Andes and the Hindu Kush Himalaya. And what this figure shows is that there's quite a difference in the ecosystem service supply between regions in the world and between different mountain ranges. And what you see here are the natural system I mentioned, so very high up in the Himalaya, for instance, the ecosystem services that were rated as the most supplied by our answers was mostly freshwater regulation with some food and feed and a little bit of habitat creation, which are 3 of the nature's contribution to people. While if you look at the Andes, it looks quite different, right? You have primarily habitat creation with some freshwater regulation and very little food and feed. So first take home is that what we all know, but it's nice to show it anyways. Ecosystem services supply vary in space across mountain ranges. And now if we look at demand, supply, and dependence, the picture becomes quite interesting, and I think that kind of enlightens us on why talking about the relationship between nature and land needs to take into account those dimensions and need to be very specific in scale. Is that here what you have for the Andes is the demand. It's actually the demand not only for the Andes, but overall. And there's a huge demand for food and feed, freshwater regulation, and habitat. And this is to kind of address the different human well-being dimensions. So if you look at your 5 dimensions, you make a weighted mean. Those are the 3 most important ecosystem services that are needed to support human well-being. And what you see here is that in the supply, there's hardly anything orange. You need a lot of food and feed supply, but that doesn't really happen. And freshwater regulation is not the primary ecosystem service supplied here neither. And so there's a discrepancy there, and here I'm just showing the dependence, and the lighter the green, the lower the dependence. So what we see in South America is that for material well-being, for instance, there's quite some dependency on those ecosystem services, and if you look at Africa, for instance, the dependency is extremely high. And now just to the comparison here for the Hindu Kush again, same ecosystem services, the picture looks different. The demand is somewhat better answered by the supply. And again, we have quite some dependency on those ecosystem service supply. So take home message, ecosystem services supply and demand don't match. They don't match differently where we are in the world. It varies in space and with dimensions of human well-being. And so to conclude, and I went over my 3 minutes, but maybe not too much, what I wanted to show here is that we think that assessments like the one we have performed and kind of small scale, so to speak, analysis of the relationship between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being is important in helping us understand the relationship and the interactions between people and land, and that those different possibly philosophies and communities have very good reasons to talk to each other and get enlightened by each other's understanding of those relationships in the world. And finally, I wanted to say that a lot of the results that were shown in the first presentations are results we are showing actually as well. So we're kind of confirming the general trends, but in mountains specifically, because we have looked at trends in biodiversity and ecosystem service supply, etc. And it's very much similar, unfortunately, to what was shown in the larger scale assessment. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a methodological question. Since the concept of ecosystem services or nature benefits for people, it's very relative because, of course, that benefit will be, or that need, or even the perception of that need will be different from an Andean highland farmer than from someone that lives in Lima or from an academic in Switzerland.
Yeah.
So how do you overcome, from what I understand, that the data comes from different sources, from a survey which was answered by different people, also by different studies. So how do you overcome this methodological problem in order to come to these generalizations? And
yeah, it's a very good question. I think that's a major challenge in that work, in that indeed the perceptions are very different. We've tried in the way we've formulated the questions and the explanatory text behind them to get to a common understanding of what we mean by good quality of life or by high supply or low supply, etc. But we can't obviously be sure. And that was kind of a pilot study, so we'll do better next time. But I think that the understanding we get from the situation, from the literature in which experiments have been used and other kind of approaches have been used, the information we get from there is confirming what we get from our survey. So whereas there are differences and we can't like straight compare our results between continents, we have some decent trust in the answers we get at the local scale, or at least at the scale of a region. but it's been a big challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a bit surprised to not being seeing any cultural services from the mountain landscape, because I think it's really picturesque, especially for people maybe that are not also living in the mountains. So I would like to know if you, in your questionnaire, did you also thought about questioning people that are visiting the mountains sometimes but not living in, or is it only like demand for ecosystem services from local people that you collect?
It was only for demand from local people, but we have a whole lot of information about cultural services, in fact, because certain dimensions of human well-being are obviously very much linked to that. And so from the 5 we had, the freedom of choice, for instance, and the social well-being were very much requiring, so to speak, cultural ecosystem services. I just boiled down the results to the less than the minimum. Yeah.
A little question myself. Is it a problem if there's a mismatch at this kind of scale? So if these people in the Andes have to import their food because the Andes doesn't meet their food requirement, is that a problem?
I guess so. I mean, how big of a problem that is not something we've really discussed yet. We've more looked at the interactions between those highlands and the surrounding lowlands. And obviously, there's a strong back and forth between highlands and lowlands in products and so on. But I mean, this is quite coarse, and I think we need to be able to go at a higher resolution, really trying to understand how important or how bad it is that certain of those services are not really supplied. And the fact is that those the figures I've shown are averages and weighted averages, so it's simplified based on the granularity we actually have in the data.
Sure.
I was just wondering about the survey, how homogeneous was it, the whole local people distance from the mountains, how homogeneous was it?
Sorry, I didn't hear too well.
How homogeneous was the respondents to the survey, or heterogeneous?
Well, there was definitely more heterogeneity between regions of the world than within, luckily. And also within region within continents, the homogeneity was larger. But one of the issues we had was that people provided their knowledge for different sized mountain places, so to speak. And so obviously someone responding for a very small mountain area could be more certain about the answers than someone who assessed larger regions. So this is another problematic factor that we have to keep in mind when we discuss those results. But yeah, luckily to some degree we have homogeneity within continents and within countries, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll finish there.
Yep.
So thank you very much. Final talk today is by Weier Liu.
Yeah.
And he's going to talk about the effect of vegetation restoration on diversity, whether it recovered or not, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. It's my pleasure to give the last talk of the conference. So I hope you still have some energy left. It won't be long, so you don't have to worry about catching your flat. So let's get into it. So my topic is quantifying effect of over 40 years of vegetation restoration. So where we zoom from the global scale to one landscape, and we do not consider all these complex functions and only focusing on the biodiversity itself. So the case study is in the northeast of the Netherlands. It's a brook valley. It's a peatland. It used to be used for intensive agriculture. It's drained and fertilized, but for over 40 years, it was restored for rich fen vegetation, which are mostly wet and mesotrophic vegetation types. So the data I used are 3 vegetation maps from 1982 to 2015, so which records the dominant vegetation species on each of the patches on the map, as shown here. And all these species are classified into 15 main types for easier comparison. And the indicator I use are richness and rareness. Since I only have the map as an input, so I only consider the number of species covered in these main types. And I use the percentage of the species in one type as for the total number as a score. For rareness, I just simply counted the red list species, the number of them. I considered both the Dutch and the IUCN list for a different scale of comparison. So for the assessment, I considered, first of all, the area weighted average, because I wanted to be spatially explicit. And also I made the transition matrix as showed in this table that account the area change from one main type to another after a period of time. So here are some findings. First of all, we can say that the restoration is an overall success simply because there is an increase in area of the target vegetation types, which are the wet mesotrophic types that is more diverse, basically. Also, there's a transition from really fertilized types to the less eutrophic types. That's what we want. We want to improve the environment, and we want to recover the more diverse vegetation types that used to live there. And also for the three scores, 3% percentages I calculate is also an increase. So we can see it's a success. But these changes of vegetation have different impact on different indicators. So if you look at the value changes from these vegetation change that we derive from the transition matrix, you can see that the target types, it didn't really improve the richness as much as the non-management types, which are the forest and rural types. You can see from the table. And also the target types improved the rareness from a Dutch perspective. It improved the red list species from a Dutch list, but not so important for the IUCN list. So to wrap it up, the message I want to convey is that our perspective on biodiversity, like the indicator we use, the scale we consider, it is really important for our actions, like the target we set, the measures we are going to take, and also how we can improve these projects, and what we do on land. So that's all. Thank you.